So in this video we're going to be talking about the most famous Roman of them all, or at least the one with the most press, Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar is essentially the successor to Marius. The thing about Marius is that Marius remained an immensely popular hero to two extremely important constituencies: A, the Roman masses, and B, the Roman legions. Both of them saw Marius as their champion, and his death only served to confirm him as one of the greatest heroes of Rome, the father of his country in the modern day, the champion of the people against the oppression of the Senate and the conservative elite. Julius Caesar is the successor to this in a number of ways. One, in that he is connected to Marius by marriage. Marius had married a Julia. And so Julius Caesar is, we can't get the details exactly, but he's more or less Marius's nephew. Julius Caesar is also, from, very early on, rivetingly charismatic. He is able to develop a following, even as a young man, and demonstrates, great bravery and skill in military situations as well. And so Julius Caesar is very obviously going to be the future of the populists. Even Sulla, before his death, recognizes this. He is supposed to have said, on encountering a young Caesar, before Caesar was forced to flee from Sulla's dictatorship, he is supposed to have seen in Julius Caesar, 1,000 Mariuses. And so Julius Caesar, as he rises up through the ranks, after the turn of the pendulum, after Sulla's death, moves toward the populists, and Julius Caesar becomes, an up-and-coming figure in the Roman political world, and this means he's useful to the people that are establishing themselves in control of the Roman political situation. And this leads to what is sometimes called the First Triumvirate. It is to be carefully distinguished from what we'll encounter later, the Second Triumvirate, or the Triumvirate of Antony Octavian. This triumvirate is entirely unofficial and behind the scenes. This is a cabal of three very prominent people who decide to throw in their lot together in order to, accomplish as much as they can and accumulate as much power, as they can collectively over what they can individually. And so the first triumvirate consists of Pompey, who has his own private army, who is periodically useful as a supporter of the Senate, but behind the scenes he's making his own way. He's getting done whatever he can, and it's Pompey who engineers a lot of the undoing of Sulla's reforms in order to make a name for himself, and in order to gain the approval of the populace. Also in the first triumvirate is Crassus, who is very powerful, largely because he's very rich. His political leanings are indistinct. Some of the things he does are very populist. Some of the things he does are in support of the conservative elite. But largely, Crassus, like Pompey, is in it for himself. Both of them find Caesar to be useful in bringing on board the massive support of the army and the people. Caesar presenting himself as the heir of Marius in public affairs. And so, the first triumvirate works for a while. There are personal bonds between them, arrangements of marriage even, and so forth. But, these three men are all too ambitious to really be able to trust each other. Crassus dies in the course of a war in the East. after making a name for himself, but not according to what he had hoped in the affair with Spartacus. In other words, Spartacus creates a civil war that Crassus is able to come in and save. He defeats the Spartans, the slave rebellion. After the consuls had been unable to do so, and so is in the populist tradition of demonstrating that the old system isn't working, and the fuddy-duddies of the elite are no longer capable of leading Rome or fighting for them. But at the same time, it's not a foreign enemy, and this makes a difference for the Romans. In putting down a slave rebellion, Crassus is not eligible for a triumph. He is only eligible for an ovation, and this means that Crassus is still hungry for glory that he could not get against Spartacus. He seeks it by going to war against the Parthians, and ends up being captured and killed. According to one story, he has gold poured down his throat in recognition of his status as one of the richest men in Rome. Either way, Crassus is out of the equation. This leaves Caesar and Pompey, who end up falling out and becoming personal enemies of each other. They deal with this at first by Pompey heading off into the east and arranging things there, and incidentally building up his own standing and his own following in the eastern provinces, while Caesar does the same thing in Gaul. Caesar is very famous for arranging Gaul and massively pushing forward its pacification and Romanization. This is partly because Caesar himself wrote a book about it, which is very widely read even today, in part because it's extremely useful in learning Latin. But Caesar, builds up a power base in Gaul. And increasingly, is demonstrating his growing power as a populist leader. The Senate becomes more and more afraid of him, and orders him to give up his province, to give up his armies, and to revert to his status as a private citizen. Out of raw fear of what of the extent of Caesar's popularity and strength. And Caesar refuses to do this. In the meantime, things are getting more unsettled in Rome. The polarization between the populace and the optimates are approaching the level of absolute breakdown of the system. And this is encapsulated in the murder of one of the populist leaders, Clodius, who had been a iconoclastic radical who had deliberately committed the religious crime of violating the women's ritual of the festival of the good goddess, just in order to break traditions and so forth and so on. Clodius is running for office against his own enemy, his own personal rival, and he ends up being killed right on the Appian Way, and this creates a massive scandal that verges over into riots in the city of Rome, and a demonstration that the extent of unrest is fragmenting Roman society. The pinnacles, the pillars of conservative thought are no longer able to make any kind of headway. The people are not listening to them, even when they are standing for the great traditional virtues of the Romans, standing for the mos maiorum, arguing for what it means to be Roman. The people have been taught to hate and fear the Senate. and the people like Cato who wrap themselves up in their nobility, in the pureness of their cause, stand apart from the rest of the Romans and see the Rome of their own day as becoming a sewer, a mire of demagoguery and greed. And so Cato the Younger, makes his arguments in the Senate and stands against people like Caesar and argues that the Romans must restore the way things were, but in many ways it's far too late for that. The Caesar reacts to the Senate's ultimatum that he stands down by doing the opposite, by marching out of his province with his army toward Rome. This is the crossing of the Rubicon. The Rubicon is the river that is the boundary between Cisalpine Gaul, which is part of Caesar's province of the Gauls, and Italy, which is the domain of the home domain of Rome at this point. Crossing out of a province with your army is illegal. And in doing so, Caesar makes himself an enemy of the state. He makes himself into a traitor. This is what's meant by his famous quote that the die is cast. There's no turning back from this action. Caesar marches into Italy with his army. He is met by Pompey, and Caesar ends up being victorious. And he comes to Rome and declares himself to be dictator. More than this, he declares himself to be dictator year after year. Sulla had been dictator in order to restore the Roman state, and Sulla, for all his reactionary extremism, and for despite the proscriptions and the extreme measures that he introduced as dictator, Sulla's dictatorship was about restoring the traditions of the Roman Republic, restoring the primacy of the Senate, putting down all these. All this, radical revolutionary stuff, ending the revolution that Marius had engineered while Sulla was away, and ultimately, the fact that he stood down from the dictatorship after only a year demonstrates his commitment to traditional Roman Republican ideals. Caesar, the dictator, comes to Rome, takes power. 40 years later, and everything by this point is broken. So on the one hand, there's an argument that Rome now needs someone to rule over it, someone to impose order where everything is chaos. In this sense, Caesar the dictator is necessary, but Caesar the dictator is also an avatar manifestation of Caesar's greed, ambition, his feeling that he and only he can put Rome to rights, and so. As dictator, he engineers a number of reforms designed to mute the Senate. And to empower the people. In other words, Caesar is dictator, like Sulla. Caesar is dictator not on behalf of all Romans, but only for his party, only for, in Caesar's case, the populists. And so everything that he does is not about the smooth governing of Rome and creating a future so much as reinforcing the fact that the populists had won, and doing everything he can to push down and disempower the conservative elite. This breeds a festering resentment on the part of the conservative elite, and they see him only as an ambitious general who stole Rome, who took Rome for himself. And so this is what leads to the assassination of Caesar. All this is cemented by, in January of the year 44, Caesar announced that he was going to no longer bother to refresh his dictatorship year after year, to declare yet another year-long dictatorship, that from this point onward he would be dictator forever, dictator perpetuum. And this was the signal to the conservative elites that things had gone too far. The accusation was that Caesar wanted to be king, and Caesar seems to have very carefully avoided the actual title of king. There are stories that he was offered the crown, and rejected it, but ultimately Caesar knew that the king was still was still covered in all the taint that the Tarquins had put upon it. The Caesars still knew that the Romans remembered the rape of Lucretia as being what represented what the kings were all about. So that the kings had been about violating the Romans, and Caesar, in his position as leader of the populace, needed to be the protector of the Roman people. And so, that said, his enemies are able to paint him as wanting to be king, as wanting all power for himself, taking the title of perpetual dictator, only played into his enemies' hands. And within 6 weeks of this announcement, Julius Caesar has been surrounded by members of the senatorial elite, and stabbed to death. These men presenting themselves as liberators of the Roman people from the tyranny of Caesar. One of the assassins is Brutus, who had the reputation for being the noblest of the Romans. And the story also went that Brutus was Caesar's illegitimate son. Certainly, there were very substantial rumors that Caesar had a long, ongoing affair earlier in his career with Brutus's mother. That said, this is part of those two reasons, that Caesar was the embodiment of Roman nobleness, of Roman virtue. And his personal connection with Brutus. This is why Caesar's last words are supposed to have been, "Even you, Brutus, et tu, Brute." There's another irony connected to this that's depicted in this painting. This painting is modern, but the statue in the upper left is a statue of Pompey, and Caesar was indeed assassinated very close to a statue that had been erected in honor of Caesar's great enemy, Pompey. And so the death of Caesar leaves Rome in the hands of Caesar's successors. The liberators, the assassins, had thought that they would be able to take charge in Rome, but the people and the army were firmly behind Caesar. Caesar, like Marius, was the hero of the common people, of the masses, and the hero of the army, demonstrating the protection of the rights of the Roman people, and all of the qualities of a great general, beloved by his men and brilliant in war. And so the people and the army rejected the assassins, so much so that they had to flee Rome and go off into the east, and were eventually hunted down and killed. And so what's left is two successors to Caesar. On the one hand, the very worldly and experienced Antony, who had the career that would make him an effective successor to Caesar, but he never had any of Caesar's charm. He never had the love of the people or the army, and so. Antony, is unable to step into Caesar's shoes in this way. On the other hand, Caesar's actual heir, the adopted in his will, and his successor in title and property, is his great nephew Octavian, a teenager with no experience whatsoever, but with a great deal of he has all of the charisma of his great uncle, and from the beginning is called young Caesar. From the beginning is looked to by the people and the masses as the replacement for the dead Caesar. And so what follows is the very uneasy struggle between Antony and Octavian, who first decide to use each other for as long as they can and end up being mortal enemies in the final stage of the civil wars. And we'll see how that plays out in the next video. For now, that's that.